Hi, and welcome back to the YouMatter podcast. This is episode 2. Welcome back. Firstly, thank you so much to those of you who are now tuning in regularly to the podcast, and also for your feedback, your lovely emails, comments, and sharing episodes on social media. I hope you enjoyed my last conversation with Dr. Adam Harrison. We talked about professional identity and also personal identity, how the two things sometimes blur, sometimes not, and how that may or may not serve us in our careers and at home. A little bit of news. Last month, I launched my website, which is Mehab, www.mehab.co.uk. So Mehab is an area to store everything. It's the home of the YouMatter podcast. There's information about my coaching services. You can be the first to find out about new courses and events. And it's also the home of my community, Mehub. Mehub is a place, again, to share resources and articles, but also to hold some deep conversations around things which, to be honest, we're probably all struggling with and wondering about as clinicians, but don't necessarily get the chance to talk about in any great depth. So do go onto the website and please sign up to the Mehub community if it's something you feel you'd like to be involved with. So on to today's episode. Today, I'm so excited to be talking to my friend and fellow coach, Margaret Collins. Margaret is an expert in imposter syndrome, or as she calls it, imposter syndrome feelings. And Margaret is an expert really through personal experience. So she started her career as a researcher and senior lecturer. But despite achieving all sorts of accolades and rising to great positions in her field, she realized that she was never particularly comfortable with her achievements, and she was experiencing a set of feelings which, when she became a coach herself, she realized came under the umbrella of imposter syndrome. So you may or may not be surprised when she tells you some of the statistics of how prevalent imposter syndrome is in healthcare workers, but that said, or even without those statistics, I think it's such an important subject to discuss. It's a phrase that is now much more in our vocabulary and is brought up in conversations that I have with clinicians all the time. There's lots and lots to pick apart around this, and I think you'll probably find lots to relate to, and hopefully some tips and some advice that might help you manage imposter syndrome feelings if you find you're experiencing them yourself. So please do continue to give us your feedback and subscribe to the podcast on whichever channel you get your podcast from. If you subscribe, then that's the best way to get all the individual episodes. I really hope you enjoy my conversation with Margaret today, and I'll be back at the end. So welcome back to episode 2, strictly episode 2 of YouMatter, because the first one was my chat with Jack. And I am so pleased today to have my really good friend Margaret Collins joining me to talk about imposter syndrome, or as she refers to it, imposter syndrome feelings. And I'm really excited because as a health professional, I hear these words talked about quite a lot. And there seems to be so much relevance when I talk to Margaret to us as health professionals. But I want to turn the tables back to you, Margaret, first of all. Well, perhaps I'll start by saying hello, Margaret.
Hello, Jo.
Lovely to have
you. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for being a guest. So, Margaret, you've told me in the past that your first experience of imposter syndrome feelings, or when you first recognize something going on, was way back in your previous career as a researcher and a lecturer. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I certainly can. And I started my career as a molecular biologist. I did my PhD. I did a series of postdocs, which are short-term contracts where you move from place to place. And everybody aspires to becoming a lecturer. But they're very competitive posts. You know, there aren't many opportunities. And everybody is in that rush to get results and to get papers. And I felt I was constantly second guessing myself. Am I good enough for this job? Have I got what it takes to stay in the market long enough to find that elusive lectureship job? And I suspect I wasn't the only one that had some concerns, but I really did feel at the time that, was I really good enough for this? I did manage to, stick around long enough to publish enough papers, to get enough research grants to find that lectureship. And I sort of thought that at that stage, the doubts would go away. Only I realized that even in the lectureship post, I still had that, am I good enough to be here? Should I really be doing this? And as I grew in confidence and I gathered my own research team and I was now managing my own PhD students and postdocs, I still had that underlying, am I really good enough for this?
So almost as you rose higher and higher, you expected it to go away, and it didn't.
And it didn't. In fact, it almost got worse, because the higher I got, the further I had to fall. When I finally did figure out, or people finally figured out, that I really wasn't as good as they thought I was, then it would be an even further fall. At that time in universities, there was very little in terms of staff development training. I had never heard of imposter syndrome, and really there were so few workshops available for personal development training that I really wasn't going to find any solutions there. It was just never talked about.
So you were aware of it, but at the time didn't particularly know where to go or what to do about it. Did you even have a name for it then? I mean, was the term imposter syndrome in your vocabulary or anybody else's?
The term existed, but it wasn't in my vocabulary. I didn't know about it until, in an effort to actually gain some management skills training, I decided to train as a coach.
Okay.
So by this time I was full-time employed as a senior lecturer, and I decided to do part-time coach training with no intention of ever practicing as a coach, but I thought that the skill set would be useful to help me manage my own, team of researchers. And that's when I first heard the term imposter syndrome. And I just thought, that's it. That's the name for what I'm feeling. Because it explained how I'd felt for pretty much all of my career. And what I realized as I went through the training and learned more about imposter syndrome is that actually it's really, really common. Many, many people have these feelings. And today we certainly have the name for them. It's much more widespread and spoken about compared to 20 years ago, which I think is great. But for me, it was that deep sense of relief that there's nothing particularly wrong with me. I just need to learn what to do with it.
Yeah. So when you were talking there, Margaret, you brought up two, I guess, signs and symptoms of imposter syndrome. You talked about that sense of not feeling good enough, and almost the more proficient you became, the more concerned you were about that. And then this sense of, there will be a moment when I get found out. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what other signs and symptoms would you, I'm getting the impression that perhaps there isn't a strict definition of imposter syndrome, it's more a collection of things. Is that right? Or is there a strict definition?
It's not a medically diagnosable condition, so there isn't a strict diagnostic term. It's a collection of things to do with an inability to internalize your own feelings of success. Okay. And so there's sort of this dissonance between what you know in your head, because in your head, you've sat the exams and got the qualifications. And it's not just about qualifications, it's about experience, years of experience. And yet the head stuff doesn't quite make it to the heart, because the heart still thinks, quite how I did this. I don't quite know how I got here. And so, one of the things that's really common is not owning your own success.
Right.
One of the second things is figuring out that other people somehow have an overinflated opinion of how good you are. It's not like I tried to pull the wool over your eyes, but somehow you, the other person, thinks that I'm really much better than I think I am.
Yeah.
And so,
Oh, I can resonate with so much of that in healthcare. One thing that I'm thinking of is I remember when I first qualified, no, before I qualified, still as a student. So I was doing placements as a physiotherapist. In your second and third years, you go out in hospitals and you're heavily supervised, but you are sometimes, scarily enough, left alone with patients by yourself. And I remember the first time that happened to me, I'd taken my subjective history. I'd done all the bits that were quite easy because you have the questions written in front of you and you write down the answers. And then there was the point at which I'd collected all the information, and the onus was then on me to actually, come up with some kind of diagnosis and perhaps even a solution. And I just remember this voice in my head going, oh my goodness, this person actually expects you to know what you're talking about and you don't know. And I think it was a third year by then, so I did know an awful lot of things, but the overriding belief was, I don't know anything. Who am I to tell this person what to do?
Yeah.
Does that ring true with imposter syndrome?
Absolutely rings true with imposter syndrome. The good news for you and for me and for everybody else who is affected is that feeling like a fraud, no matter how intense that feeling is, doesn't mean that you are a fraud. Many of the people who are affected by imposter syndrome feelings are recognized experts in their field. They really are respected by their colleagues. It's just this internal feeling that they have.
Yeah. And is there a sense, from what you were describing, first of all, there's obviously a bit of a process where those feelings get reinforced, not necessarily due to the truth, but how does that work? That almost the better you get, the more those feelings are reinforced.
Well, part of this comes from the psychology of, if you have an underlying belief, no matter whether that belief is true in air quotes, we still look for evidence to support that belief, and so we will notice the things. If we feel that we really don't belong, if we feel that we're really not good enough, we will pick up on all those subtle clues, all the incidents in our past that have reinforced that will come to the fore. And of course, we will filter out and pay so much less attention to anything that contradicts that. And so what can contribute to imposter syndrome feelings are things in our past. And again, it's not diagnostic that this happened to you, therefore you will. But often people who have imposter syndrome feelings are the first. I would say that they are trailblazers. But of course, the flip side of that coin is, I feel I don't belong, I shouldn't be here.
So sort of a sense that you're someone that might push yourself forward into a new arena or a bit of a no man's land, and then you've somehow got to deal with what it feels like to be out there, to be that trailblazer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so being the first to do anything, being the first professional, being the first musician in a family of scientists, the first scientist in a family of musicians, being the first person to be a healthcare professional in your family, these would contribute to the feelings of, I don't belong, should I be here? But actually, we already know that unconscious bias will play into this big time. If there's any reason why we are different to the community that we are a part of. And so gender is a big thing, race and color and culture, disability, anything that sets us apart where there are societal and cultural differences and unconscious bias that again feeds into people like you don't really belong in a culture like this.
So it's almost like you are, by your circumstances, feeling like an imposter in your own environment, and then you've got this kind of confirmation bias going on that I have this feeling, and as you say, our brains are, for whatever reason, quite hungry for confirmation to confirm this thing that we've started to believe. So do you think it is likely to be more common in professions like healthcare, or is that just, that's the world I live in and I hear a lot about it?
The research shows that if you ask the population in general, are you affected by imposter syndrome feelings? About 70% of people will say, yes, at some stage in my life or my career, I have experienced imposter syndrome feelings. And of course, it's a spectrum. There are some people who are on one end of the spectrum and they're affected mildly, they recognize it, they see what it is, and they just get over it. There are other people who are towards the other end of the spectrum, and it is crippling. The anxiety, the stress that it causes them, it's crippling. And fortunately, I suspect that most of us fall somewhere in between those two extremes. But 70% of the general population, both men and women, if you go in professions and you do research in professions where expertise or intelligence is valued, and of course healthcare professionals perfectly fit that bill, then actually the numbers who report imposter syndrome feelings goes into the high 90s. And so, if you are not affected by imposter syndrome feelings, you are the exception rather than the rule.
And then you might start to feel like an imposter. No, we won't go there. So, so I hear that, absolutely, that phrase. I've heard you say that before, Margaret, and it really hit home with me that if you are in a profession that highly values expertise, then it's quite likely that you're going to be affected. And to me, that just defines healthcare. And not only do we value expertise, we're also quite rightly under this, I was going to say, umbrella of needing to be evidence-based, and yet particularly in professions like mine, which is a relatively young profession within healthcare, the evidence base is there, but it's sort of, I would say embryonic, but it is a young profession. And as more stuff comes out, then a lot of the things I was taught at university are shown to be not what we should be doing anymore. It brings into question a lot of the things that you hold dear. And so you've already got this feeling that I described from student days of, I'm not quite sure that I feel that I'm qualified to make these decisions. And then there's this sort of tug all the time of this, even the research doesn't back you up, so of course you don't know what you're doing, and even the research tells you that. So I get it that if you're predisposed to it and you don't find some way to get a handle on it, it can be quite a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, or a bit of a spiral situation in healthcare.
Absolutely. And of course, most people who are affected by imposter syndrome feelings are incredibly good at hiding it.
Right.
Because they are very intelligent, because they are very skilled, because they are very experienced, they're actually really good at putting on that confident front that hides the insecurity inside. And so many of their colleagues wouldn't have any idea that they were affected by imposter syndrome feelings, which of course makes you feel more like an imposter if you don't think anybody else is affected.
Yes. Yeah, I totally see that. So not just with colleagues, but we obviously pick up quite early on that we're supposed to look like the professional in front of the patient. And imagine the patient most of the time wants us to look like that. So we're almost having to create this illusion of feeling more in control than perhaps we do. And then I hear what you're saying. If you then are waiting to be found out, then the longer that goes on, the more intense those feelings are going to be. And
as you said, within your profession, you are seeing that things are evolving. In my background from research, this is the opinion, this is the best that we know at this moment in time.
Yes.
But in 6 months' time, in a year's time, that might be shown to be wrong as more evidence emerges. And so, in a sense, people in our types of profession are sitting on the edge of a wave that's always about to collapse underneath them.
Yeah.
And, what we're asking is for people to be expert surfers.
Yes.
You've just got to keep on the crest of the wave and just keep going. With
no, I've heard the term reluctant experts, but I think expert surfers is probably better. And I think wound up in what you've just said about how you want to present yourself to patients and to colleagues. There's also this thing, isn't there, about not looking like you're trying hard. For some reason, there seems to be this thing about I do work really hard, but I have to, I don't know, not tell people that or be embarrassed about it or something. Try and be calm and make it look easy.
Yeah. People who are affected by imposter syndrome feelings often have very unhelpful ways of thinking. And part of that is the drive to look good, to look perfect. You're in a profession that requires it, that demands it. And so we want to look, we put in the hours. And yet, particularly for women, hard work is a real shame trigger.
Wow.
Dr. Brené Brown, who's done quite a lot of work into shame and vulnerability in the United States, really shows how for women that hard work is a shame trigger. And so we are expected to be on top of our game and make it look easy. And so if we know that quietly we have spent hours preparing for this, we don't tell anybody else, which of course they don't tell us. And so we think that they show up all ready to go, ace. It just exudes from them naturally. And therefore we feel even worse about our guilty secret that we've slogged hard and long for this and have, sweated blood in order to become half as good as they look. It does feed into a very unhealthy, very vicious cycle that ultimately leads to stress and burnout.
I find that fascinating, and it makes me think, where does that come from? And I, personally, I can only think back to being at school, and I was at a school where it was not great to be intelligent. It was just about okay if you're good at sport as well.
Yeah.
But I remember getting very used to, as you say, hiding things a little bit, and certainly wouldn't talk about how long I'd spent on homework and things like that. Yeah. I mean, that's perhaps a very obvious and slightly cliched driver of that kind of process. But this thing that you're talking about with Brené Brown, where it's actually a shame trigger. I mean, do you have any thoughts as to why, what purpose that serves and why it affects women particularly?
It goes really, really deep, and it's part of the way that we're socialized as children. There are so many clips, and if you were to do an internet search for a BBC clip called Boys' Toys and Girls' Toys, it's like 3 minutes long, and it shows how adults, unsuspecting adults, treat babies differently depending on whether they think the baby is a boy baby or a girl baby. And so even as adults, we treat children differently depending on what we think their gender is. That socialization continues right through our adult life. And so, young girls, be nice. Young girls don't show off. Young girls don't make noise, be seen and not heard. And yet for boys, the socialization is slightly different. For boys, the biggest driver is don't be weak. And that comes into this, man up, boys don't cry. And so although both men and women are affected by imposter syndrome feelings in approximately equal numbers, it often shows up very differently, because a man will often come across as being more confident or even slightly arrogant, because they can't hesitate, because being seen as weak is an even greater shame trigger than being found out as an imposter.
So whilst not wishing to overgeneralize, the kind of overcompensated, overconfident persona, and let's not attribute it directly to men, but let's call that a masculine energy persona, and this kind of nice, calm, generous, sweet, but capable persona are both potentially manifestations of the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, that's why it's not medically diagnosable, and so it's not anybody's job to go out and try and diagnose other people. Oh, I think you've got. It's not helpful, not helpful at all. But in recognizing that sometimes different behaviors come from very unexpected roots.
So how might we, I hear what you're saying, we're not out there to spot this in other people and to point it out to them, but how might we recognize it in ourselves in a helpful way? Yeah,
it is helpful when you finally begin to recognize it. So first of all, it's recognizing the history, because once you realize that there's often a pattern in the history of being the first, of being different, of internalizing maybe unconscious bias as well as experience real unconscious bias, this sort of predisposes you, and you might then think, okay, this is a set of filters that I need to re-examine. But there are also ways of thinking, and so we will often minimize our own achievements. People with imposter syndrome feelings are really very bad in many cases at accepting even simple compliments. We'll disregard them, we'll bat them away. If we are forced to accept a compliment, then we will often credit other people. Oh yes, but I didn't do it on my own. It was a team effort. Someone
Right.
helped me, someone coached me, and it was a mentor that supported me. Somebody put me forward. You're attributing your success to other people. And if we are really backed into a corner and we have to accept the compliment, then do you know what? We'll minimize it. I think people who have imposter syndrome feelings are sometimes, compulsive learners, compulsive qualification collectors, because the minute we've got this level, we then think, well, if I got that, then it can't be so good. I must need the next one. And then you get that and you work hard to get that and you get it. You think, well, really, is that all it is? I need to go for the next one. So we can recognize in ourselves both these unhelpful patterns of minimizing our achievements, over crediting others, and then disregarding it as anybody can do that. Yeah. These are absolute classic signs that we need to reevaluate our thinking. And the part of that is learn to accept what you've done. The clients that say thank you, the colleagues that tell you how good you are, the testimonials that you get in whatever form they come, whether it's years experience on the job or whether it's qualifications, begin to recognize that actually it didn't happen completely by chance, but that you had a role in it. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean that there's no luck involved, because a definition of luck that I use is that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So that nice the opportunity might happen at random. The opportunity you might have little or no control over. But if it happened and you hadn't been prepared, you just said, oh, look, that was really bad luck. If only I'd known and could have been ready. So the fact that you were ready is down to your work in preparation.
And then acknowledging that you prepared, and you need to give yourself credit for that rather than pretend you didn't prepare.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, habits and habitual patterns of thinking can feel so immutable. It can feel as, how do I change my thoughts? I've been thinking like this since I was a kid. How can I possibly learn to think differently? But, neuroplasticity is also talked about almost as much as imposter syndrome feelings nowadays. We can learn to think new thoughts. Old dogs can learn new tricks. We learn new habits all the time.
Can you just explain that? Actually, a majority of people listening to this will know exactly what neuroplasticity is, but can you explain it in relation specifically to imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. Neuroplasticity is the ability of our brain and our brain cells to grow and to change. In years gone by, they thought that the adult brain was fully developed in your late 20s, and after that it was downhill. And certain cognitive functions may well go downhill after that, waistlines and all the rest of it. But brains can continue to grow and develop. And the more that we think thoughts of a particular type, the more that we do actions of a particular type, the more we develop new neurons and synapses and connections, the infrastructure that we need to actually support those. And an analogy that I use is looking at a meadow of long grass. Imagine on a summer's day, you're standing on one side of the meadow, you see the grass blowing in the wind, and you decide to walk from one side of the meadow to the other. If you immediately reached the other side and turned back and looked, you could see where you'd walked. The grass would be trampled down. But if you came back a couple of hours later, the grass would have sprung back and you'd probably not see your path through it. But if you kept walking that path, backwards and forwards, exactly the same route, time after time, day after day, you'd very soon have a clear path. And so we can think new thoughts. We can train ourselves to think in new ways, to develop new habits. And then it becomes easy.
Yeah,
but we're not used to thinking about habits in the same way.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about habits. So we, as therapists, would talk about neuroplasticity, not exclusively, but often in relation to getting the body to accept certain functions where there is pain present, and we're trying to almost retrain the brain's perception of a movement in relation to pain. It's a very broad description, but I've never really thought that actually exactly the same process is going on with habits. And I know there are all sorts of timescales and number of times you're supposed to do something before a habit's embedded, isn't it? And I guess what you're saying is that's the number of times that you have to walk that path before the grass stays down.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you've given us a really nice list of really things to look out for. So this tendency to underplay your own achievements, to attribute success to others, or to perhaps overemphasize luck, to keep quiet how hard you're working, and maybe either have a very strong sense of trying to look calm and collected, or perhaps to overcompensate and be quite vocal about what you're doing. So learning to spot all of those things is the first stage, and I'll ask you a little bit later on about specific things we can do about it. But what would you say are the consequences of just continuing to function this way and ignoring it?
There are very significant consequences for some people. Like I said, it's on a spectrum. And if you're at the not very affected end, then it can just be mildly annoying. If you're at the very affected end, the research shows that imposter syndrome feelings are strongly correlated with increased stress, anxiety, rumination, depression, and decreased career satisfaction across the board. Because if you feel that you're a fraud and you don't belong, if you feel that someone might find out, many people with imposter syndrome feelings will then be perfectionists, because if I'm perfect enough, then they won't question it. If I can present myself as being perfect enough, they won't doubt me, they won't dig too deeply. And of course, if we're doing that, then we will both overwork and over-prepare for even the smallest tasks, which means we're more likely to be stressed, tired, and burned out in the first place. But if we feel that there's a risky decision or a risky arena where we might be asked to either volunteer for a stretch position or a leadership role, well, if we're not sure that we're up to it, we'll be maybe slow to volunteer. If there's a place where we're asked for an opinion, and we're not certain that our opinion is currently accurate because, we talked about everything moving forwards, then maybe we'll play it safe, or we'll express no opinion at all. We'll wait for somebody else to fill the gap. And that often leads to other people being promoted or getting advantages ahead of us. They might be invited to take on leadership roles or positions. They might be invited to go for promotion. And a bit of us, still knows deep down, actually, we are okay. And I've got more experience than them, or I've got the same qualifications and been doing the job for longer. And yet they're going ahead. And it's not that we've got anything against them. We then have it against us, because why am I not putting myself forward? Why am I not going for it? Which then feeds into that, poor career satisfaction. We don't, we don't apply for jobs. People with imposter syndrome feelings tend to stay in their jobs in a particular place for longer than colleagues who are not so affected, because, we're safe here. They haven't figured me out. I've, got my front up so they can't see the weakness behind. I think I'm safe. If I go for a new job, a new role, a new place, I've got to start building this all over again, and that's quite scary. And so the consequences of imposter syndrome feelings often for the individual result in, anxiety, stress, poor career satisfaction, frustration. And of course, for the organization or for the team or for the colleagues, then there's talent that's not being used. There's creativity that's not being tapped.
Margaret, I'm sitting here nodding, and I imagine most people listening will be nodding very, very intently. This seems to ring so true in healthcare. That last bit you said about the body of talent sitting under a ceiling, really.
Yeah.
And just going back to what you said at the start about the fact that people with imposter syndrome are often trailblazers, and they're actually the people that perhaps are interested in progression and pushing things forward. And yet there's, what I hear you saying now is there's this kind of this limiting factor, this ceiling that comes into play. So you've got these great people that are potentially the ones to forge new ground, and yet there's this self-imposed ceiling and restriction, which I can only speak for healthcare, and sorry to only harp back to that, but it just rings so true for healthcare environments.
Yeah,
it makes me quite sad.
Yes, and for me it's the paradox that I know I experienced within me for many years, and I've seen it in so many people, because I now work with people with imposter syndrome feelings to help them overcome them. What I see is this: they know on the one hand that they have the ability and that they've got the skills and the experience, and on the other hand they can still doubt whether they can pull it off. It's the head and the heart that and that paradox, that tension within us is often really, really uncomfortable. There's a researcher who's based at Stanford University, and she's called Carol Dweck. And she talks about her research career has been based upon what she calls mindset.
Right.
And she says that people either have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. And she's got a book on it, and she's delivered a TED talk on it. And basically the difference is that a growth mindset realizes that wherever I am, I have more potential. And the more I work, the more I develop that potential. The fixed mindset is that, I have whatever I was born with, or whatever God gave me, and I'm either good enough or I'm not. Now, I find that many intelligent people know that they have a growth mindset in their heads, but in their hearts have the fixed mindset. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to fail in public. So what we will do is we will play it safe, and we will often not go for things that we might not get. So I wonder how many people have not applied for a job because the shame of not getting it, if it was publicly known that they'd applied, would be worse than not applying at all. And I've seen that in so many occasions where people have been reluctant to put themselves forward because, well, if I didn't get it, or if I wasn't selected for interview, then that would be even worse. That would be proving that, yeah, I was right, I really wasn't good enough.
So can we help ourselves with this? Do you think you can ever have enough self-awareness to not only spot these things, but then bring about a change? Or do we always need someone else to intervene? What do you think about that?
I absolutely believe we can do a lot to help ourselves. Now, when it comes to things like unconscious bias, we know that within our culture, within our societies, within our institutions, our organizations, we need to work to minimize unconscious bias and the barriers that puts up to people's success. Absolutely. At the same time, we need to work on our own thought processes. One of the things I would really say is that we need to believe in our own hearts that feeling like a fraud doesn't mean that we are a fraud. To begin to recognize and own our own achievements, not just contribute it to external factors such as luck or other people being nice. And so quite fairly treat ourselves as we would treat our best friends. Learn to acknowledge and accept our own achievements. For me, it's really powerful knowing what would my best self want me to do.
Right.
And so there have been many situations where I have had what I would experience as an imposter hijack. And in that moment, I sometimes have a choice. Do I let the hijack happen, keep quiet, keep small, stay back? Or do I do what my best self would want? And for this, it really helps me, and I think it helps people to recognize the situations where that imposter shows up. If I think back to earlier in my career, my imposter really showed up when I was unexpectedly put on the spot and asked a question. Right. So I had to give that expert opinion in public, but without being prepared for it. Mm. And my default reaction was to avoid it. And so I would often in that moment be struck by a stress reaction, the complete rabbit in the headlights thing. I would imagine that I was going quite red. I'm not quite sure whether I did go red, but I could feel the heat coming up from my chest, through my neck, up my face. And I would do anything to get out of the spotlight as quickly as possible. And sometimes earlier in my career, that would mean leaving the room. Later, I learned to stand my ground, but deflect the spotlight. Oh, I'm not sure I've got an opinion on that. Why don't you ask? And hand it over to the acknowledged expert who is standing just over there. Anything to get the attention away from me. And so for most of us, we have situations where that's likely to happen. Is it going to be when you are questioned by your peers? Is it going to be when you've given an opinion out there and somebody has questioned it or even contradicted it? Mm-hmm. What do you normally do? And we might have two options, and one might be to fight and the other might be to flee. But actually, would your best self want you to stand the mid-ground and say, do you know what, that's really interesting. I wonder why you think that. Because in having the ability to open up a conversation like that, you're going to learn far more than either jumping on the other person to quash them or running away saying, oh yeah, you must be right, I must be wrong. It's the mid-ground where the growth occurs.
I think that's so useful for us, again, in healthcare, because one thing that we recognise in ourselves that we struggle with is to engage in debate, which stays healthy and which actually moves on, as opposed to, as you say, somebody adopting the right position and somebody else conceding the wrong position, or conceding the right position, I guess. And it takes a lot, doesn't it, to sit, as you say, in that middle ground and not be right or wrong, really, just to stay with it long enough to actually, with that other person, find a way through.
Yeah. And for me, it's about that healthy curiosity. Sometimes it's, well, I wonder what you know that I don't know yet. I wonder what evidence that you have access to, or what experience you have access to that I'm missing out on.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find really helpful was to give me the courage to hold my ground, is to say, well, in my experience, because nobody else has my experience, it's genuine for me. And it could be that my knowledge is limited or my experience is limited and can be improved on by sharing experience or knowledge that somebody else is offering me. But it's not wrong. It's mine. And therefore it's a very secure place to stand.
When you talk about it like that, Margaret, it sounds like such a nice place to live. All I hear about that is kindness. And when you say, what would my best self want, I think of another phrase of, if I was only coming from a place of love and kindness, how would I behave? And that's to myself as well, not just other people, as opposed to if I was coming from fear and defensiveness and competition. How would I actually behave if all that mattered was love, kindness, and progression to a better place? To walk to the other side of the field.
And it's a brilliant place to be. It's a brilliant place to create. It takes huge courage, though. So don't ever underestimate or undervalue the courage that it takes to do this. Because in your profession and in mine, we are trained in critical analysis. We are trained to look for what's wrong and how to put it right.
Yeah.
If people do get competitive or argumentative or wanting to be right, they're actually only doing exactly what they've been trained for years.
Yes.
And so in a sense, what we are bringing to the situation now is just another layer on top of that in order to create more rounded human beings, more human situations.
Yeah, and you alluded to sort of organisational change before we started talking about personal awareness. And I was going to say, do you have any ideas of what changes we might be able to bring about, for example, within the health services? But I also hear what you're saying about this balance, that healthcare is founded on the premise that one person has knowledge that will support and help the other person, and that needs to be portrayed. And by that very nature, there's going to be a relationship of someone sharing knowledge and basically having an answer and hopefully being right. And if we took that away, then it kind of it does a disservice to the recipients as much as anything. But what I'm hearing is almost what we need to weave in is to protect ourselves, a balance of the way that plays out in our head as meaning as to who we are.
Yeah. And I think, as individuals and as organizations, it is that middle ground where we are not necessarily certain. That for many of us is an uncomfortable place to be, but it is where growth occurs. It is, in a sense, the heart of that growth zone, that learning zone. And I think of professions where they genuinely seem to hold investigations that are no blame investigations. Let's just find out what happened here. Let's just find out what is the best way forwards so that we can all learn from this. And I have to think about, places where I've worked in the past and teams that I've been a part of. There have been some groups and some teams that have had that culture, and it's been great. And there have been other teams where, everybody was afraid of making a mistake because they will be picked on. And it creates a really toxic environment. I guess that, there are always some people who will flourish in any environment, but it's not one where it's not suited to bringing the best out in most humans.
Yeah. So just drawing things towards the end of this conversation, with this sort of, I know I wasn't educating you as to how healthcare workers are, I'm sure it was no great surprise to you, but if you were brought in as a consultant, Margaret, to my hospital department or my clinic, knowing what you know about the likely makeup of healthcare workers, what might be the sort of the big takeaways to start to make change for individuals and within organisations such as healthcare, like I've described?
So my top tips for both individuals and organisations is to recognise that having imposter syndrome feeling not good enough, is actually part of being human. And so human kindness and compassion is pretty good salve for almost everything. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't aspire for more, aspire to be better, aspire to improve. We need, like most things in life, you need both. You need that balance to find the way forward. As individuals, we need to be prepared to both be compassionate to ourselves and to challenge ourselves. So to learn new ways of thinking, right, to learn new ways of behaving, to step forward into the bits where we don't know yet and accept that that's okay. That's how we grow. As teams and as organizations, again, we need to make sure that we are removing any unfair barriers to progression or to career advancement or development, because the very fact that this is unconscious bias, for most of us, we are not doing it deliberately, we are not aware of it. But if we look at our organizations, if we look at our systems, we can find the areas that we need to change, we can find the areas that we need to grow. If I look at my area in academia, the people of a different color or culture are just so underrepresented. If I look at the state of UK academia right now, we've got over 25,000 professors, and I think at the moment we've got about 29% being female, but out of those 25,000, only about 130 are male and black, and only 24 are female and black.
Wow.
So the figures there suggest that institutionally, organisationally, we have so much work to do. And as individuals, I have to confess that the chances are that we have internalized some of this. And so we need to grow as well. We need to challenge ourselves and stretch our comfort zones.
Yeah, and that would certainly ring true within certainly physiotherapy and some other areas of healthcare as well. Yeah, so thank you, Margaret. I'm hearing on an individual basis, learn to notice these types of things. I won't list them again because you did that beautifully earlier, but start to notice these traits, accept them because they are part of what got you to where you are and make you the great health professional, generous, caring, but also ambitious and enthusiastic being that you are. But own your success and celebrate it. Celebrate it in others. I think, from my experience, that's a really important thing. I think it takes so much courage to celebrate your own success in front of colleagues in an environment where that is not necessarily not accepted, but it's just not the norm. So start to behave that way yourself, but also, would you say maybe gently challenge when you see others using those deflecting mechanisms that you've talked about, or batting away compliments? Is it helpful to just return the compliment again and see if you can get it accepted? I don't know.
It's often helpful to just return the compliment again. Why not? Why wouldn't we do that? I think in terms of pointing out to people, did you see what you did there?
Yes.
Maybe less helpful. And so if you really do have a friend or a colleague who you can see doing this, depending on the quality of your relationship, you may well be able to have that quiet conversation afterwards. Once you take them to side, rather than in public. But you cannot change other people, nor should you really seek to change other people. But you can invite them. If they invite you, you can start that conversation with them. And it is possible to gently give compliments and point out that I see that you did this, what I did, and come back to me. What I learned was, and then share an experience of yours where you learned how to accept compliments, where you noticed that the effect that it had on others. Because absolutely, the further you get up your career path, the more, whether you need it or whether you intend it or not, the more you are a role model for the people that come after you.
Yes.
They are looking up to you and thinking, this is what happens. And I think it's great when, so many leaders are now more honestly talking about their uncertainty or their insecurity. And I can think, in terms of politics, the Jacinda Ardern's, who say that they are affected by imposter syndrome feelings, who say that they feel that they don't have all the answers, but that they're great collaborators. And so they'll go out and they'll seek information from other people before they make their decisions.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important distinction. So we talk a lot about vulnerability, but it's not just about indiscriminately spilling all your insecurities, is it? I mean, what you just said about Jacinda Ardern there is, yes, I am affected by this, and no, I don't always have the answers, but what I am great at is I'm a fantastic communicator and collaborator, and I use that skill. And so she's both on one hand acknowledging her feelings and where she feels less than perfect, but then also celebrating the success of who she is and how she's able to manage that, which is a much more healthy presentation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That would be a leader that others would aspire to follow.
Yeah.
And I think you and others in the healthcare profession, again, should be leaders that others aspire to follow. And a leader who is perfect probably doesn't exist.
Well, I'm certainly inspired, as I am every time I talk to you, Margaret, to try and be that leader. Oh, thank you so much. Throughout this whole thread, I am sure people listening will have just had bells going off all over the place that ring true to their own environment and their own experiences. It's so helpful. I'd love to have you back sometime and continue and have the conversation go even deeper. So, accepting that imposter syndrome affects lots of us, and with the statistics you've told us, is unlikely to go away, and maybe we shouldn't even want it to because there are advantages. If people are listening and think, well, yes, I recognise myself in an awful lot of that, and I would like to try and do something about it, how might they get hold of you, Margaret? What services might they be able to access from you if they're interested in addressing these imposter syndrome feelings?
Thanks for the invitation, Jo. What I would say is I'm not sure that I can ever cure anybody of imposter syndrome feelings. I know I still am affected by them. But for me, it's almost now a badge of courage. My imposter shows up when I'm about to do something brave.
Okay.
So I now know this is the big step that I'm being called to make.
When you feel the fear.
And yeah, absolutely feel the fear and then do it anyway. And so people can reach out to me through my website, margaretcollins.com. And if they wanted to email me, info@margaretcollins.com gets straight through to me. But I have written a book that's available on Amazon, and it's called Beyond Imposter Syndrome. And I have programs that are available on the website. And I'll actually create a page for you and your listeners. So the podcast is YouMatter. I will create a page that's margaretcollins.com/YouMatter. And then they can have access to the resources that I'll make sure I put there for them.
Absolutely wonderful. And people listening, I would really encourage you to do that. So seek out the YouMatter page on Margaret Collins's website. I've done some of Margaret's courses myself, and they're actually really enjoyable. And as you can hear, Margaret's got the most wonderful voice to listen to. So stick your headphones and absorb all their wonderful knowledge that she's got to impart. Margaret, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Jo. It's a delight.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
See you again soon. Bye-bye. Well, what a wonderful episode, and I think you'll agree, extremely relevant to us as clinicians. I think it's really important that we get to understand the concept of imposter syndrome more and more, and how it is specifically relevant to us in healthcare. I'd love to know your feedback, which things resonated, which solutions you think you might be able to put into practice. Do let us know. And remember, if you're a busy clinician looking after people every day in all aspects of your life, you matter. See you next month.